And hit my jingle. Hello and welcome to the 10-Minute Tabletop Talk podcast. My name is Grant Ellis, and today I am joined by
Sean Reynolds of Monte Cook Games.
Sean. If you were to give advice to a game designers looking for longevity in the industry of tabletop games, what's maybe two or three pieces of advice you might give them if they're looking for longevity?
Find something that you're good at and do that, but don't be afraid to experiment and careen, over to something that you haven't tried before and see how that works out. Because if you don't get outside your comfort zone, you're never going to know if you're good at something else. And it's good to be a multi-trick pony. I'm a person who's a jack of all trades, and I like to have a lot of little things that I'm pretty good at, but not super specialized into any one thing.
What's a time where you felt you had to challenge yourself in your career as a designer?
Pretty recently, when we started working on the 5th edition version of some Numenera stuff. I didn't know 5th edition. I'd only played it briefly when I was at Wizards of the Coast a few years ago. And so it's like, all right, brand new game system that I was not involved in designing. Time to sit down and start figuring out how this works and writing for it.
So from my observations and from some of the earlier interviews I read, it looked like you were pretty set with the standard 5e classes as opposed to adding new classes. Now, I might be wrong and things might have changed since then, but I was looking at some of the early ones. What do you think one of the challenges of bringing Numenera into 5th edition was that you felt you handled exceptionally well?
Well, much of Numenera is just that it's weird technology that is presented as magic. And so I think that we did a really good job of presenting these items as something that are magic-ish and work kind of like magic items, but aren't magic. And that was really fun. It let us do some really wild things that, as far as I'm concerned, D&D hadn't really done before.
When at MCG, you all work on a variety of systems, games, settings, genres, etc. How do you manage the mental shift going from a game like, say, 5th edition conversion of Numenera to, like, say, an Invisible Sun playtest or expansion? Because they're very different games.
It's a bit of a challenge. Some of us handle it a little better than others. I am kind of eclectic in my interests, and so I'm used to, shifting terminology, talking about physical things versus game stuff. It's funny to hear Monty and Bruce struggle with stuff. Like, we'll be playing Invisible Sun, and Bruce is like, so what kind of a saving throw do I have to make against this attack?
That's a spot on, Bruce. No, yeah. It's the great debater and college wrestler in Bruce that leads to those questions. But you do have a pretty incredible team at MCG. What's something you've learned from one of your coworkers there that was valuable to you?
Wow. Oh man, that's a really good question. We have very similar interests in the sort of games that we like to play and design. And I think my biggest struggle is that, having worked on Pathfinder for so long, I really tend to get into finicky details of things. And Monty is always just encouraging us to say, Cypher System doesn't worry about that. You can just let somebody make a roll, and if you need something weird to happen, do it as a GM intrusion.
That's an interesting and poignant point, and that's something when I read the Cypher System rulebook and I'm working with someone maybe learning it, many of the players I've worked with, or the game masters, actually come from Pathfinder as well, and they get very caught up on a detail. I say, I want to take you back to the beginning of the book and read something to you of what Monty says about the rules of Cypher System. So it's right there codified in the game text too, where you can intrude and make something weird and bend. It's a very modular game. With that said, sort of a segue, what aspect of playtesting do you find the most enjoyable, and what aspect do you find the most challenging?
I like exploring new spaces with new rules, and it gives us really cool opportunities to do fun and surprising stuff with the game that we didn't realize the game could actually even do in the first place. Sometimes the challenge is taking that weirdness and presenting it in a way that people who aren't game designers can use and can have fun with without devolving into a lot of rules lawyering.
And here's a question. Now, I've known your name. Your name has been known to me since the RPGA days and the earlier days of the internet. And so there's a storied history in sort of what we might refer to as organized play. What are some of your favorite organized play memories over the years?
I think one of the wildest organized play memories I have is one year when Monty and I were supposed to run an RPGA adventure for the GMs who were going to be running it at Gen Con. And so we were there at slot 0 holding the printouts of the adventure, frantically reading them in the 10 minutes before we needed to run them for these other GMs. So Monty and I awake at 6:00 in the morning reading these adventures for the first time so that we could run them, so all these GMs could run them for all the other gamers at Gen Con.
Mm. Oh, goodness. That hits a little close to home. But and so those are interesting memories. Now, you worked on an adventure that I actually ran from second edition. I want to say it's the Liberation of Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like to work in a very classical setting like Greyhawk and to touch that fictional space and add your own fingerprints to it?
I loved working at Greyhawk. It's a setting where we call it stone soup, where there's some key elements that we kind of define for the setting, but we leave so much open for the GM to do. And working on the Liberation of Jeff, we had this progression of Hill Giant, Frost Giant, Fire Giant, never did anything with Cloud Giants. And so I'm like, cool, I want to do a Cloud Giant adventure. And that meant, having actual Cloud Giant structures on clouds. And if the PCs fall off, they fall to their deaths, which is always an interesting, border of the realm challenge.
Within the confines of D&D, and then I'm going to spread this out into the other systems, is there is a typical monster type that you find very interesting to work with, as far as either design, the mechanics it works, or even just the aesthetic? If so, what would that be?
I don't know if I have a preference to any one type of monster, but when I taught a monster design class, I always told people that a monster should have something cool it should do when it's its turn in combat, something cool it can do when it's the player's turn in combat, and something cool it can do outside of combat. And those three things help you build cool stuff for the players to interact with, for and against, and stuff for the GM to build encounters and adventures around. And that could be demons, it could be humanoids, it could be dragons, it could be whatever.
Or my personal favorite, the Mummy Lord. Gotta love the Mummy Lords. They sit right between giants and dragons and are often forgotten, as far as the scaling challenge. And then expanding outside of a very classical RPG like D&D, and where we've poke into the more surreal or strange, what's something about a particular design or aspect of Invisible Sun that you were particularly proud of, or that was great to see come to light or see in play?
The fun thing about Invisible Sun is that Monty built it to be something where there are no absolutes, and absolutes get broken. So we had a scenario where there was a monster that literally its entire power was it was so strong that it could punch through dimensional barriers and just could not be stopped. But I had this high level Vance spell that made this impenetrable maze. And so I threw this maze up around an area that we were trying to protect. And Monty's like, all right, so we have literally the irresistible force and the unmovable object coming head to head. What are we going to do about this? And he had to come up with something on the fly for how these two things would interact. And it bought us a few rounds to, buff up ourselves in anticipation of fighting this thing. That was pretty sweet.
Now, you had the opportunity to publish your own, what I'll refer to as almost like a genre book for Cypher System with Stay Alive. What is something about that experience you'll always carry with you, and something that you would like to pass on to other designers?
That was really challenging. That was actually the longest book that I'd ever solo written. And it was me deciding all the topics that I wanted to cover. And I got stuck writing about scary clowns for a long, long time. And for a while, the rest of the design team thought the book was going to be half about scary clowns. But I mean, I love horror. I love writing about horror. And I think this is a case of finding something that you're passionate about, write about that, and the readers will feel that passion in what you're creating.
Folks, this has been Grant Ellis and Sean K. Reynolds from Monte Cook Games with the 10-minute Tabletop Talk podcast. Bye.
Bye.